Russia in early 1917 was an immense empire. It stretched across 2 continents, from Europe to the Pacific Ocean. Many different peoples lived within its vast borders. They spoke a multitude of languages. They followed diverse customs and religions. Yet, all these people were subjects of one ruler, the Tsar. Governing such an enormous and varied land effectively was an almost impossible task, especially with the outdated methods of the Tsarist regime. Communication was slow, and central control was often tenuous in remote regions. The Russian climate added to the nation's challenges. Winters were notoriously long, harsh, and unforgivingly cold. Summers in many agricultural regions could be short and prone to drought. Farming was a difficult and precarious existence for the majority of the population. Peasants, who formed the backbone of Russian society, struggled constantly to grow enough food to survive. This persistent hardship bred deep resentment and a yearning for change. The immense strain of World War I, which had been raging since 1914, exacerbated all these existing problems. Russia stood perilously on the brink of revolution. Tsar Nicholas II was the absolute ruler of Russia. He firmly believed in the principle of autocracy. This meant that he, and he alone, held all political power. He was convinced that God had divinely chosen him to rule the Russian people. While he was known as a devoted family man, he lacked the qualities of a strong and decisive leader, especially in times of crisis. He stubbornly resisted calls for meaningful political reform. He seemed unable or unwilling to understand the true depth of his people's suffering and their desperate desire for change. His decisions, often influenced by his wife and dubious advisors like Rasputin, frequently made difficult situations even worse. Early warnings of the regime's instability were stark and numerous. In 1905, Russia suffered a humiliating defeat in a war against Japan. This unexpected loss shocked the nation. Shortly thereafter, on a day that became known as Bloody Sunday, peaceful protesters marching to the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg were brutally shot down by the Tsar's soldiers. This horrific event shattered the people's long-held image of the Tsar as a benevolent little father. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 proved to be the final undoing of the Tsarist regime. The Russian army, though vast in numbers, was poorly equipped, badly led, and ill-prepared for modern warfare. By the early months of 1917, the situation in Russia had reached a breaking point. In March 1917, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated. The February Revolution of 1917 was not meticulously planned or led by any single political party or revolutionary group. It began almost spontaneously, with women textile workers in Petrograd going on strike to demand bread. Their protest quickly grew. They marched through the city streets, their numbers swelling as other factory workers and ordinary citizens joined them. Their initial demands for food soon broadened to include calls for an end to the devastating war. Following the Tsar's abdication, a new governing body was hastily formed. It was called the Provisional Government. This government was primarily composed of moderate politicians drawn from the Duma, the recently dissolved Russian parliament. They promised to introduce sweeping political freedoms such as freedom of speech and assembly. For a brief period, a wave of hope and excitement swept across parts of Russia. However, this new government was born out of chaos and inherited a nation in crisis. The provisional government made a critical and deeply unpopular decision. It chose to continue Russia's involvement in World War I, honoring its commitments to the Allies. Simultaneously, another center of power emerged and grew in influence, particularly in Petrograd. This was the Petrograd Soviet of Workers' and Soldiers' Deputies. This fundamental division of power created immense instability and confusion. Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, better known as Lenin, was a lifelong dedicated revolutionary. He was the charismatic and iron-willed leader of the radical Bolshevik faction of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. Lenin was a fervent believer in the theories of Karl Marx. He was convinced that Russia, despite its agrarian nature, was ripe for a socialist revolution. He argued that the industrial working class, the proletariat, should seize political power and establish a dictatorship of the proletariat. Lenin's journey back to Russia in the spring of 1917 was a dramatic and pivotal event. Germany, which was still locked in a bitter war with Russia and its allies, saw a unique chance to further destabilize its eastern enemy. The German authorities controversially agreed to help Lenin and other exiled revolutionaries travel across German territory. Lenin arrived at the Finland station in Petrograd in April 1917. His arrival electrified his supporters and sent shockwaves through the political landscape. Upon his arrival in Petrograd, Lenin immediately presented his radical program, which became known as the April Theses. He called for an immediate end to Russia's participation in the imperialist World War I. He demanded that all land be confiscated from the nobility and transferred to the peasants. Most controversially, he proclaimed the slogan, "All power to the Soviets." This meant he rejected any cooperation with the provisional government, which he denounced as bourgeois. Lenin's simple, direct slogans like peace, land, and bread proved to be incredibly effective propaganda. The Bolshevik Party, under Lenin's determined leadership, grew rapidly in numbers and influence throughout 1917. By the autumn of 1917, Russia was teetering on the brink of complete collapse. The provisional government, led by Alexander Kerensky, was increasingly weak, isolated, and discredited. It had failed to solve any of the country's pressing problems. The war against Germany dragged on, with continued defeats and desertions. The economy was in freefall, with rampant inflation and severe shortages of food and fuel. Chaos was spreading in the countryside as peasants began to seize land from the gentry without waiting for government approval. Soldiers were deserting the army in droves, simply walking away from the front lines. Lenin, ever the astute strategist, believed that the Bolsheviks must act quickly and seize power before others did, or before the country descended into total anarchy. The Bolsheviks, under the operational command of Leon Trotsky, meticulously planned their armed uprising. During the night of October 24th to 25th, Bolshevik forces began to systematically take control of key strategic points throughout Petrograd. They occupied railway stations, post offices, telegraph exchanges, bridges, and government buildings. There was surprisingly little organized resistance. The provisional government had lost most of any remaining popular support and control over the military garrison in the capital. The most symbolic and widely publicized event of the October Revolution was the assault on the Winter Palace. The takeover of Petrograd was accomplished with relatively little bloodshed, though fighting in Moscow and other parts of the country would be more severe. The October Revolution had triumphed, changing Russia and the world forever. The Bolsheviks' seizure of power in October 1917 didn't mean their control over Russia was secure or universally accepted. They faced immediate and fierce opposition from a wide array of groups across the vast country. These opponents included supporters of the deposed Tsar, liberal Democrats, moderate socialists like the Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries, and various nationalist groups seeking independence. These diverse anti-Bolshevik forces became collectively known as the Whites. They soon formed armies and launched a desperate struggle to overthrow the new Bolshevik government, which became known as the Reds. Russia plunged into a brutal and devastating civil war. The Russian Civil War, which raged from roughly 1918 to 1922, was an incredibly destructive and tragic conflict. Fighting was widespread, engulfing vast territories from European Russia to Siberia and the Far East. Both the Reds and the Whites committed terrible atrocities and engaged in campaigns of terror against perceived enemies and civilian populations. Millions of people died, not just from direct combat, but also from widespread disease, starvation, and pogroms. The war shattered the Russian economy, which was already weakened by World War I. Factories closed, transportation networks collapsed, and agricultural production plummeted. The Civil War was further complicated by the intervention of foreign powers. Several allied nations, including Great Britain, France, Japan, and the United States, sent troops to various parts of Russia. Despite facing formidable challenges, the Red Army, brilliantly organized and led by Leon Trotsky, eventually emerged victorious in the Civil War. By 1922, most of the organized white resistance had been crushed. With their hard-fought victory in the Civil War, the Bolsheviks turned their attention to the monumental task of creating a new state structure. In December 1922, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, often referred to as the Soviet Union, was formally established. This new nation was conceived, at least in theory, as a voluntary federation of equal Soviet republics. The initial union brought together the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, RSFSR, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, the Byelorussian Soviet Socialist Republic, and the Transcaucasian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. Moscow, the historic heart of Russia, became the capital of this new sprawling Soviet state. The USSR was founded on the principles of Marxism-Leninism. The Communist Party, which was the new name for the Bolshevik Party, held a monopoly on all political power. The state took control of the major means of production, including factories, banks, and land, with the declared goal of building a classless, socialist society. In theory, ultimate power was supposed to reside with the workers and peasants, exercised through their elected councils, the Soviets. In practice, however, the Communist Party leadership, particularly its Central Committee and Politburo, made all the key decisions. During the desperate years of the Civil War, the Bolsheviks had implemented a harsh economic policy known as war communism. This involved the forced requisitioning of grain from peasants to feed the cities and the army, the nationalization of all industries, and the suppression of private trade. Recognizing the dire situation, Lenin introduced the new economic policy, NEP, in 1921. The NEP represented a temporary strategic retreat from full-blown communism. It allowed some private enterprise, particularly in agriculture and small-scale trade. The early years of the USSR were a period of both cautious hope for a better future and continued hardship for many. Vladimir Lenin's health began to seriously decline after he suffered a series of debilitating strokes, starting in 1922. As the acknowledged founder and paramount leader of the Soviet state, his illness created a climate of great uncertainty and anxiety about the future leadership of the Communist Party and the country. In his final writings, which became known as his testament, Lenin expressed profound concerns about the direction the revolution was taking. He worried about the growing power of bureaucracy within the party and the state apparatus. He also offered candid and often critical assessments of his potential successors among the top Bolshevik leaders. He was particularly wary of Joseph Stalin, whom he described as having concentrated too much power in his hands as general secretary of the party, and suggested that comrades find a way to remove Stalin from that post. Lenin died on January 21, 1924, at the age of 53. His death sent shockwaves throughout the Soviet Union and the international communist movement. Immediately following Lenin's death, an intense power struggle erupted among the leading figures in the Communist Party's Politburo. Joseph Stalin, born Iosif Vissarionovich Djugashvili in Georgia, was a shrewd, patient, and utterly ruthless political operator. His position as General Secretary, which he had held since 1922, gave him considerable control over party appointments, patronage, and information flow. During the power struggle of the 1920s, Stalin skillfully played his rivals against each other, forming temporary alliances only to break them when it suited his purpose. By the late 1920s, Joseph Stalin had successfully outmaneuvered all his major opponents and consolidated his grip on the Communist Party and the Soviet state. He emerged as the undisputed supreme leader. He effectively marginalized Leon Trotsky, who was eventually expelled from the party, exiled from the Soviet Union, and later assassinated on Stalin's orders. The era of Stalinism was about to begin in earnest. In 1928, Joseph Stalin launched the first five-year plan, This was an incredibly bold, ambitious, and centrally planned program designed to rapidly industrialize the Soviet Union. Stalin and his supporters believed that the USSR was dangerously underdeveloped compared to the major capitalist powers of the West. He harbored a deep fear that without a strong modern industrial base, the Soviet Union would be vulnerable to foreign attack and ultimately crushed. The 5-year plan set extraordinarily high, often unrealistic targets for industrial production. The primary focus was on developing heavy industry, the production of coal, iron, steel, machinery, and electricity. New factories, massive industrial complexes, power plants, and mines were constructed at a breathtaking speed, often in remote and inhospitable regions. All available resources, both human and material, were poured into achieving these ambitious goals. The plans demanded immense effort, sacrifice, and hardship from the Soviet people. Workers faced long hours, low wages, and harsh working and living conditions. Propaganda relentlessly urged them to overfulfill production quotas, celebrating shock workers and Stakhanovites as heroes of socialist labor. Simultaneously with the drive for rapid industrialization, Stalin initiated the forced collectivization of agriculture. This policy aimed to abolish millions of small, privately owned peasant farms and consolidate them into large, state-controlled collective farms, or kolkhozes, and state farms, or sovkhozes. Stalin believed that collectivization would increase agricultural efficiency, ensure a reliable grain supply for the growing urban population and for export, and break the political and economic power of the wealthier peasants, known as kulaks, whom the regime viewed as class enemies. The first 5-year plan, and those that followed, did succeed in transforming the Soviet Union from a predominantly agrarian society into a major industrial power in a remarkably short period. The drive to modernize Russia was achieved through iron will and immense cruelty, laying the foundations for the Soviet superpower but also for decades of totalitarian terror.